Thanks, Bob. Bob very modestly didn't mention that most of the things that I've done in my archaeological career, he was an integral part of. And while I didn't go to Penn to study with him, I sure spent a lot of time studying with him. And the Archaeology Performance book is part of the Purcell Hodder series. And I could go on and spend the entire 25 minutes talking about Bob's influence on my career, but I think I'll wait till we have some wine in hand before we do that. Thank you all very much for coming. I want to talk a little bit today about how I view archaeology and where archaeology can take us going forward, not just in terms of how we study it, but what we can do to really use it in order to help people build better futures and at the same time give them the incentive to preserve their past. And while Bob is right, our old motto was people, not stones. A branding consultant who was kind enough to take on the foundation says most people don't know what you're talking about when you're talking about stones. So our new motto is building futures, saving past. Supposedly it has more resonance when he tested it. You all can decide. How many people here are archaeologists or studying archaeology? Almost everybody, wow. How many people are not affiliated with Brown University in any way, shape, or form? Okay. Second best school named after a color, as we used to say. Here's the end of slideshow. So I thought I'd just begin for a second by showing you something cool, if it works. There you go. This is the site of Chotuna, a monumental site dating back to about 700 or 800 in northern Peru. And we actually use drone flights to monitor what's going on in archaeological sites. We look for looting, we look for encroachment, as well as they're also used for mapping the sites. Because you can actually map about 20 sites in 4 days that would take you 3 months with a theodolite or a total station or anything like that. But I like to show it just because it's kind of cool footage, but it gives you a sense of the monumentality of some of the northern Peruvian sites that people don't really have a sense for, other than Parker does, of course, because he works there all the time. I don't have to call you Professor Van Mockenberg, do I? Anyway. So, as Bob mentioned, I have had a very diverse career in business and in archaeology. Now I get to do the things that I love to do. I get to work in amazing places like this, discover sites, punch the occasional Nazi, which is one of the favorite things I get to do in archaeology. But really, I get to take the two skill sets that I've developed over the years, one in archaeology, the other in business, and try to combine them to both preserve the past, but also help those communities that live around the sites. Now, most of you probably are aware that some of the world's greatest archaeological sites, like Chotuna, like Petra, like a whole slew of others, coexist with some of the poorest people in the world. And the sites are at risk because the communities are at risk because their futures are uncertain. And the biggest risk that they face is poverty. Poverty is the main driver both of destruction of archaeological sites, and it's the main driver of risk to the communities, not just economically, but in terms of health, lack of education, and really the future of generations to come. So you all read about all the time, Palmyra this, Palmyra that, the Middle East, ISIS and ISIL, and it's terrible and it's heartbreaking. It's a minuscule percentage of the heritage that we are losing in the world today. And by the way, I don't have any idea what to do about ISIL. And I'm not sure that, unless you have an army and a whole lot of resources that any of us do. But what I do know is that most of the destruction is coming from preventable economic causes, in which I include looting, agriculture, mining, energy production and transmission, commercial and residential development, grazing, and a whole slew of other activities that are economic. And therefore, it occurred to me fairly early on in my archaeological career that if the problems were really based in economics, then so the solutions had to be, and we really needed to rethink that. And I remember being shocked when I went back to graduate school and just asking how many people in my cohort of 15 or 16 had ever even taken a single class in business or economics, and the answer was 3. And I said, that's an awfully low number when you're trying to talk about what motivates human beings in order to act. And it doesn't really give you a sense of how you're going. People who haven't thought about it in that way aren't going to think about economic solutions. Now, I will say it took me a while to get there, and what should have been obvious. This is the site of Inca Yacht in Bolivia. It's where I did my dissertation research. And this site was slowly being destroyed by the local community. Not out of malice or lack of knowledge of its importance, but again, driven by its poverty. So crops were being grown all over it, animals were grazing up against the walls, and this incredible building called the Cañete, it's the largest single-room roof structure in the Inca Empire, and it's 80 meters long, it's 25 meters wide, and the roof would have been about 60 feet or 20 meters high. And they played soccer in here. Why? Because at 10,000 feet of altitude, it's great if the ball doesn't roll away very far. And it's kind of fun to play rebound shots off the wall anyway. And so all of these things were going on, and I took the traditional academic approach to stop them, which is, this is really important, you know, you shouldn't do this. And I think I was as effective as any of you who've probably tried that technique in the field. It sometimes works for an hour. Normally it doesn't even work for that long. And people would say, yes, that's great, but we're going to keep on doing this. And I mean, it really shouldn't be surprising when people are undertaking economic activities that they need to survive. They don't need some foreigner coming here to tell them to stop, especially if you cannot offer them an economic alternative. I don't know how you ask a person who's doing something to survive to stop doing it if you can't offer them another economic alternative. And for the most part, archaeology not only hasn't done that, I don't think it's considered it its responsibility to do that. And I'm here to argue in part that we can do it, we must do it, and it's our moral and ethical responsibility to do it. So much so, I would like to see it in the Archaeological Code of Ethics, though I don't think it will ever get itself there. So in talking with these communities and after working with them for a while, this site is kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's 3 hours from the nearest large city, which is Cochabamba in Bolivia. There's only one road there, and after a series of community meetings, we came up together with a bottom-up solution. Let's build a gate across the road. Bolivians can pass for free, but we're going to charge foreigners $10, because any foreigner who made it here from Cochabamba had already paid for a guide, paid for a car. $10 was not going to stop them from coming in to see the site. And the people in the community looked at me like I was crazy. Why? This is one of the Bolivia is the poorest country in South America still today, and at this time, probably 80% of the rural population was subsisting on $1 a day. So the notion that someone was going to pay 2 weeks' salary to look at these stones seemed extraordinary. So as part of the agreement, I said I would pay for the gate, I would pay for a guard for a month, we'd have another community meeting to discuss it. First week, 4 tourists came, the second week, 3 more. $70. I thought maybe I should go into venture capital, but that's a heck of a return on 50. But more importantly, the attitude of the community changed. And what happened was the first thing they did with the money was to buy out the people who were grazing, buy out the people who were growing crops, build a soccer field on the other side of the river where there were no, at least apparent, archaeological materials or ruins. And then they wanted to learn more about it. Why? Because this was no longer an irrelevant relic that was important but intangible, but this was actually a potentially sustainable economic asset that they could exploit and feed their families for generations to come, and they understood that more knowledge might give them the ability to earn more money. Now, I know for many of us in archaeology, describing an archaeological site as a sustainable economic asset is horrible terminology, but I've been called a commoditizer and of heritage and much worse. But if the alternative is both poverty and economic destruction, I'm perfectly prepared to allow that to happen. So I came out, and that's when I started 5 years ago, roughly, the Sustainable Preservation Initiative, which is essentially designed to do exactly that. It's to create sustainable, non-destructive economic opportunities utilizing archaeological sites as a driver so that communities have a chance to build their futures and save their past. Because if you can take an archaeological wonder and turn it into something that provides jobs and provides futures, that's a win-win for both communities and for heritage. And that lets these communities thrive, and when they thrive, they preserve their archaeological sites. And frankly, it's the only method that I have seen that provides a sustainable way that doesn't depend long-term on the involvement of an NGO or a foreign archaeologist. So I'd really like to share a couple of the lessons that we've learned in a couple of examples, and I'll provide a couple of case studies, because since most of you are archaeologists, I can actually get down a bit into the actual data. Rule number one is the rule that I just stated. Everything we do has to have an endpoint for us. If your project only lasts as long as your presence on the site, I would suggest to you very strongly that your project is about you and not the community in which you're working. So the idea is to allow folks to be on their own and make independent decisions about what they want. When I'm in a nasty mood, I refer to that as neoliberal decolonization, but I'm not in one, so I'm not going to do that today. But the point is, we need to empower these communities. We need to put the decision-making process with them and not with us. Now, of course, there are two things that these poor communities are missing that you need for success in the global economy that we take for granted. One is resources and one is knowledge. And so our job has to be to provide both of those so that people can have successful, and that's rule number two. So we have developed a tremendous capacity building program. It's almost like a mini business school. So many programs talk about how to make pretty crafts, how to make replicas of things that were found in an archaeological site. And yes, that's part of it. But if you don't know how to do accounting, if you don't know how to do inventory management, if you don't know how to do materials procurement, if you don't know how to do customer service, what you're going to end up with is a bunch of pretty crafts that nobody can sell, that people are at home, and a bunch of disillusioned community members. And if you don't believe me, go take a tour of many of the projects that are done by certain governmental agencies, be they from USAID, be they the EU, that do these things. Rule number two, small scale, bottom-up programs work tremendously better than top-down, large, cookie-cutter imposed paradigms. The next time I see a visitor center whose maintenance budget is bigger than the entire income of the community in which it is located, well, I see them and I go, that can't possibly succeed. I want to give a tour of failed site museums and visitor centers of the world. It would be, I see you all laughing, you've all seen them. There are these monstrosities, they cost $1 million to build, and they might be using one room in the corner for storage of some agricultural product that has nothing to do. There might be a guard chain smoking a cigarette over there. The big kitchen restaurant has nobody in it, and probably the range and whatnot and refrigerators have already been taken out. It doesn't work. Now, aid agencies are incentivized in a very odd way. We learned this in Jordan. USAID's people are evaluated two ways. How many dollars do you spend, and how many jobs that last for 30 days did you create? 30 days. Now, I don't know what your definition of sustainable is, but I'm going to bet it's longer than 30 days. Well, if I want to create a lot of 30-day jobs and spend a lot of money quickly, what am I going to do? I'm going to build buildings. I'm going to build the biggest building I can as fast as I can with the most expensive materials and not give a you-know-what about maintenance, long-term use, or applicability. It makes no sense to build a giant structure for a site that gets 20 visitors a day. For a site like Inca, where we were getting 5 a week, this was a sustainable, meaningful business with a $50 gate. Now, I'm not telling you there's a lot of these $50 projects that can be done, but I will tell you there's a lot of $5,000, $10,000, and $20,000 projects that can be done. I'm going to show you some, and all of the projects I'm going to show you eventually are going to be things where we spent less than $50,000 to create a series of sustainable jobs and protected sites. So, to me, if you take nothing else away from this talk, if you take away the capacity building, the scale, and the third thing, people need to have resources, seed capital. Apple didn't start without seed capital, Google, Microsoft, so why should we expect poor people in these communities to do that? I do note that almost every one of those companies started in a garage and not in a giant visitor center. But the idea is you need seed capital. Now, we all know the story. Give a person a fish, they'll eat for a day. Teach a person to fish, they'll eat for a lifetime. But that's really only true if they can afford a rod and a boat. Because if not, and this is another big problem with capacity building problems, if you teach somebody and they don't have the resources to actually implement their business and access to the markets to sell their products, all the knowledge in the world is not going to help you. And this is the 3 key pegs upon which our paradigm is based. Small scale, bottom up, knowledge, resources. Now, I mean, this is somewhat problematic for archaeologists. Bob mentioned I have a unique background in starting companies, but I'm going to bet that no one here's archaeological training has included any of the things that I've just talked about, with the exception of being able to teach. And even that's not required at some universities. But even if you're a good teacher, no one becomes an archaeologist because they want to start a series of small businesses. I mean, I'm here to suggest that this either needs to be a part of curriculum or that collaboration with other departments has to be a critical aspect of what we're doing in order to protect archaeological sites going forward. So let me step back for a second. I want to give you a couple of case studies and data and examples of what I'm talking about. I'm going to start with the numerical data, and then I'm going to tell you a couple of human interest stories. As Bob knows, I used to only do the data because I'm a data person, but I'm working on my marketing skills too. And it turns out that human interest stories actually have a lot more resonance, go a lot more viral, and raise a lot more money for the foundation than do hard numbers and data. And I was one of the people who loved the data and the hard numbers, but it turns out that I'm in the distinct minority. So you can see that here, people here are making products, they're going to class. And one of the things that we've also learned, which is incredibly important as we put these programs together, is, and we're all anthropologists, or almost all of us, culture matters. First of all, technology isn't going to do this. Technology is important, it's wonderful, it's implemented, but the best way to bring about and effectuate change is frequent human interaction and cultural understanding and sensitivity. And the only folks in the world who have that naturally are anthropologists. We have a critical role to play in this kind of programs. Now, that means when you come, you need to tailor your programs using the 3 legs of the pedestal that I just gave you, or 3 legs of the stool, but you need to tailor it to local culture. You need to take cooperatives and people, et cetera, how they find it, rather than you imposing your way of doing it. And that's worked incredibly effectively for us, but there's one gigantic exception to that. And that is you must, no matter where you are working, include and support women. Places that we've been working, Jordan, Guatemala, Peru, are all incredibly macho societies. Women have had no access to the formal economy or jobs. And that's in spite of the fact that every study points out that women make better business people and entrepreneurs, and I'm here to tell you, I've seen it, it's true. And it's not just that they're smarter, that we all know they are, but it's also the case that this is their only opportunity. No one's ever offered them one before. And when people know they only have one opportunity, they grab it, seize it, exploit it, and do not let go of it. And by the way, that's what makes incredibly successful entrepreneurs. So for example, here's most of the women, we were 23 total, they weren't all here for picture day. 23 women from the site of Pachacamac in central Peru. Pachacamac has enormous issues because, slides are out of order. Pachacamac used to be a half hour outside of Lima. Pachacamac is now essentially in Lima. Urban encroachment is occurring incredibly, incredibly quickly. I'm sorry, I'm going to skip photos because I know I have an encroachment photo and it's not in the right place. Apologies, my advisor would be very upset. There it is. I mean, here's your site, there's your city. So you can see that it's getting closer and closer and closer every day. So we have this cooperative of 24 women. We've run a business school with them. They've designed a whole series of products, t-shirts, silk screening, sun hats, because this is the desert, embroidery, and a whole slew of things. And we've taken this capacity program and brought them into the formal economy. They are actually paying taxes and things, which means that they can do things like take credit cards, take mass orders from groups coming to visit the site, issue legitimate tax receipts under the Peruvian economy. Extremely important to get people into the formal economy. So in the first year, these folks sold $10,000 worth of products, and this being their second year, they're on a path for selling $14,000 worth of product. That's extraordinary, and it's life-changing economically. But it's not just life-changing economically. These are two members of the cooperative, grandmother and granddaughter. The grandmother is 77 years old, shows up at work every day. And one of the things we do, in part because it's incredibly important to us to make our programs better, in part because of our academic, we ask, why are you here and what are your dreams? What do you want to get out of this program? When we asked her why, she said, remember she's 77, no one ever gave me a chance before. This woman is extraordinarily talented. It's incredible what she's done. She heads the embroidery group. She does more and better embroidery work than anyone there. She teaches the other to embroider, passing on the knowledge that she's learned over the years. But it's extraordinary. Her granddaughter is there because she wants to go back to school but can't afford to. And in fact, her work at this program has won her a scholarship to take some business classes at a local university. So the changes aren't just economic, they begin there. But I would argue with you that if you really want to change people's lives in health, in education, until they feel stable economically, it's just not going to happen. We've moved into Guatemala. In Guatemala, we have an alliance where people are making mostly jewelry. We have 11 women, several of whom come from a local home for battered women. The rest live in the neighborhood, who for the first time, again, are generating significant amounts of income. And I put this slide up because it reminds me of perhaps my favorite SPI story. We have these round tables. This one's in Guatemala. And this woman brought her husband, who's the gentleman in the purple and white shirt there. And we'd never had a husband or any male show up at these when the women were doing round tables. It just isn't done in this culture, but that's hopefully going to change more. And he asked to speak. And sure, And he got up and said, when my wife started working, I was opposed to this. I tried to forbid her and finally told her if my house wasn't clean, if the food wasn't on the table when I wanted it, if everything didn't work perfectly in the household as before, I was going to make her stop. After several months of both the extra income and the benefits, but also the changes in his wife that he saw, he said, Mi muro de Berlin se cayó. My Berlin Wall fell. He is now the biggest proponent of women working in his community. So again, economic benefit driving social change. Now, you may also be saying, okay, what does this have to do with heritage? And I'd say three things. One is, archaeology has to be a living science. It doesn't mean anything to be the past in the vacuum. Second of all, I think if communities are going to allow us to practice archaeology, this is what needs to be done. And third, and I saved the best for last, almost every site that we've worked at, looting and encroachment has stopped. Because there's now a group of local people who earn money by the site not being destroyed, and they're an army of people who stop others from destroying it. So when somebody starts to build a house on the corner or the site or starts to dig a looting hole, you take on these women will come out and stop you from doing it. And that's far better than any law, any fence, or anything of that sort that you could possibly construct there. So from my perspective, this is the future of archaeological practice. This is where we need to be going. We need to change our curricula. Even harder, we need to change our incentive system because nobody gets tenure or a promotion or funding for doing this. And I could go on and rant about that. I'm not going to, but think about what the structural impediments are to doing this. Now, I find that most archaeologists and anthropologists, more than probably any other field, want to do great work, great things for their communities. But just like these folks need resource and knowledge, so do we as practitioners in order to be able to implement these kinds of programs or to assess when it's right to do this kind of program. Because there are places where economic development is not the answer. There is no universal silver bullet, but it's certainly the answer in an awful lot of places of this type. And rather than thinking that you're doing something by incorporating people in your research design, that's about you. The production of knowledge is what we do. And until we make that production of knowledge edible by these folks so that they can build their futures from it, I don't see why they would ever want to grab on to that. So let me conclude by reminding people what Elie Wiesel said about memory in the past. He said, without memory, there is no culture, there is no civilization, and there is no society. We have the obligation to provide that memory. That's what archaeology does, but not just past memory. Things that today will be the memories of the future, and in the future can be the memories for generations to come. Engagement and empowerment are two very modern words that not only build futures, but enable us to save pasts if we really want to do that. Thank you.